Emma, dinner's ready. Grace called from the kitchen as she stirred the sauce. A faint coming echoed from the back of the house. Bennett sat on the couch, laptop on his knees, flipping between spreadsheets. He worked from home most days, and though his job had its stresses, he enjoyed being able to spend evenings like this with his family. The smell of garlic and simmering cream wafted through the air. "Hey," Grace called again, this time softer, leaning through the kitchen doorway. "How's that presentation coming along?" Bennett glanced up from his screen and gave a tired smile. "Almost done. Just need to make sure the graphs don't look like they were made by a toddler." Grace laughed, wiping her hands on her apron. "Well, don't take too long. You know Emma hates cold pasta." He closed the laptop with a satisfying click, stood up, and stretched. All right. Duty calls," he joked, walking toward the kitchen. The small moments like this were what Bennett cherished most, the normalcy of it all. He handed Grace the salt shaker as she reached for it, and their hands brushed. "Smells great," Bennett said, peering over her shoulder at the bubbling pan. "Spaghetti carbonara," Grace said with a little grin. "Thought you'd earned it this week." Bennett kissed her cheek lightly. "What would I do without you?" "Probably eat cereal for dinner," Grace teased, tapping him playfully on the arm with a wooden spoon. They both laughed, and for a fleeting moment, Bennett felt his heart swell. Everything seemed perfect. He couldn't have guessed the foundation of his life was about to crumble beneath him. The house had quieted down. Emma was tucked into bed, her nightlight casting soft stars onto her ceiling. Grace had gone upstairs for a shower, leaving Bennett alone at the dining table to sort through the day's mail. Bills, advertisements, and the occasional card from distant relatives were the norm. Bennett leaned back in his chair, absently tearing open envelopes. One plain, unmarked one stood out. His brow furrowed. No return address. No stamp. It must have been hand-delivered. Probably just some junk, he muttered to himself as he opened it. What fell out wasn't junk. A stack of glossy photographs spilled onto the table, sliding across the wood. Bennett froze. His eyes caught the first one, and for a second his brain didn't register what he was looking at. The first image was Grace, sitting in a dimly lit bar. Her face was unmistakable. She was smiling, her head tilted flirtatiously toward a man. Bennett flipped to the next picture, his fingers trembling slightly. Grace and her boss, Richard, sitting closer. Then another, showing them in an embrace. The next photo was worse. Grace and Richard in a hotel room, laughing, holding glasses of champagne. The final picture made him drop the stack altogether. It was explicit, leaving no doubt about what had happened. Bennett stared at the images for what felt like hours, his chest tightening with every second. His ears buzzed, and he could feel his pulse pounding in his temples. He clutched the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "No, this can't." His voice cracked. "Bennett." Grace's voice startled him. She was standing in the doorway, a towel draped over her shoulders, her hair damp from her shower. She frowned when she saw the envelope and the scattered photographs. Her face went pale. "Bennett, I..." He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "What the hell is this, Grace?" His voice was low, dangerous. Grace stepped closer, holding her hands up as if to calm him. "I can explain. It's not what it looks like." Bennett grabbed one of the photos and held it up in her face. "Not what it looks like. That's you with him. At a hotel. You think I'm blind?" "It's not like that," Grace said, her voice trembling slightly. "It was a mistake, Bennett. It meant nothing." Bennett slammed his fist on the table, the sound reverberating through the room. "A mistake? You don't accidentally end up in bed with your boss, Grace. How long has this been going on?" Grace hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. "How long?" Bennett's voice was sharp, cutting through her silence like a knife. "A few months," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Bennett let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Months? While I've been working late to give you and Emma a better life, you've been sneaking around with him?" "It's not like that, Bennett," Grace said, her voice rising. "You don't understand what it's been like. You're always so busy, so distant." "Distant?" Bennett's voice cracked. "Are you kidding me right now? I've been over backward for this family. For you. And this is how you repay me?" Tears welled in Grace's eyes. I didn't mean for it to happen. Stop. Bennett held up a hand, his voice cold now. Don't you dare cry and act like the victim here. You knew exactly what you were doing. Grace took a step closer, reaching for his arm. Bennett, please. It didn't mean anything. I love you. Bennett recoiled, as if her touch burned him. Don't. Just don't. For a moment, they stood in silence, the air between them heavy and suffocating. Bennett finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. Does Emma know? Grace's head snapped up. No. Of course not. She doesn't need to know. She doesn't need to know that her mother is a liar and a cheat. Bennett interrupted. Do you even realize what you've done to this family? Grace's tears spilled over. Please, Bennett. We can work through this. I'll end it. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Bennett shook his head, a bitter smile playing on his lips. Fix this? You think this is something you can just patch up? You've destroyed us, Grace. There's no going back from this. Grace's face crumpled, and she sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. I'm sorry, she whispered through her sobs. Bennett stared at her, his heart a tangled mess of anger, betrayal, and sadness. He wanted to scream, to cry, to hit something, but most of all, he wanted to escape. I need to think, he said finally, his voice devoid of emotion. I can't do this right now. Grace looked up, desperation etched across her face. Bennett, please don't walk away. But Bennett was already heading toward the door. Bennett sat in his car in the driveway, the engine off. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he stared blankly out the windshield. The photograph sat in the passenger seat, taunting him. He couldn't erase the images from his mind, couldn't stop hearing Grace's voice pleading with him. Everything felt like a lie. Every kiss, every laugh, every moment they'd shared. Had it all been fake? He looked up at the window of Emma's room, the faint glow of her nightlight visible through the curtains. I have to be strong for her, he whispered to himself. But even as he said the words, Bennett felt utterly lost. Bennett sat at the corner table of a dimly lit cafe, his hands folded tightly on the table. The stale smell of coffee and the murmur of distant chatter were the only distractions in the quiet room. He had chosen this spot deliberately, far from the prying eyes of strangers. His mind was focused, sharp, and cold as ice. He glanced at the photographs resting in the folder beside him. He didn't have to wait long. The cafe door opened with a slight jingle, and Richard walked in, scanning the room. Richard was the type of man who seemed to glide everywhere he went, his polished shoes clicking against the floor with irritating confidence. Spotting Bennett, he sauntered over and slid into the seat across from him without invitation. Bennett, Richard began with a smug smile, leaning back in his chair. What's this about? Got some work stuff to discuss? Or is this about Grace? Bennett clenched his jaw. Just wait, he said, his voice low and controlled. Richard's smirk didn't falter. He crossed his arms and leaned back, clearly unbothered. Moments later, the door opened again. Grace stepped in, her face pale, her body stiff as she spotted Bennett at the table. Her eyes darted to Richard, then to the empty seat beside him. Without a word, she walked over and sat down, avoiding Bennett's gaze. The tension was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Grace, Bennett said coldly. Glad you could make it. Bennett, please, she began, her voice trembling slightly. Save it, he snapped, cutting her off. The door jingled one last time. Claire, Richard's wife, entered the cafe with her coat pulled tightly around her. Her face was a mask of simmering anger, her movements brisk and purposeful as she joined the table. Claire, Bennett greeted her with a nod. Claire's lips tightened as she took her seat, her sharp gaze flicking between her husband and Grace. I knew it, she said quietly, her voice icy. I knew something was off. Richard shifted in his seat, his confidence faltering for the first time. What's going on here? Richard asked, trying to sound authoritative but failing to hide the edge in his voice. Bennett reached for the folder and dropped the photographs onto the table, spreading them out for everyone to see. The color drained from Grace's face. Bennett, don't, Bennett said sharply, pointing a finger at her. Don't you dare. Richard's eyes darted to the photos. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The smug grin was gone. You've destroyed our families, Bennett said, his voice trembling with controlled fury. He pointed at Richard. You think you can just sleep with another man's wife and get away with it? Richard opened his mouth to speak, but Claire cut him off. How long? Claire demanded, her voice cold and sharp. How long, Richard? Claire listened. How long? 6 months, Grace admitted softly, her voice barely audible. Claire's head snapped toward Grace, her eyes blazing. 6 months? She repeated. You've been sneaking around for 6 months, lying to me, to your daughter, to him? She jabbed a finger in Bennett's direction. Richard finally found his voice. Look, let's not blow this out of proportion. It was a lapse in judgment. Bennett let out a bitter laugh. A lapse in judgment? That's what you call screwing my wife? Grace buried her face in her hands. Bennett, I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't fix this. Bennett snapped, slamming his fist on the table. Heads turned from nearby tables, but he didn't care. You didn't just betray me, you betrayed Emma. You betrayed us? Grace's voice cracked as she tried to plead. It wasn't about you. It was a mistake, Bennett. I was confused. Confused? Claire cut in, her voice seething. You weren't confused when you booked hotel rooms, were you? Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is ridiculous. I'm not going to sit here and be attacked like this. Bennett, if you're looking for some kind of apology, I don't want your apology, Bennett interrupted, standing as well. He locked eyes with Richard, his glare like steel. I want you to know that this isn't over. You think you can walk away from this unscathed? Think again. Richard rolled his eyes, his arrogance resurfacing. What? You're going to ruin me? Please. No one's going to care about some petty little affair. Oh, I wouldn't be so sure about that, Claire said, her tone laced with venom. She stood and faced him, her eyes narrowing. You forget I know all your dirty secrets, Richard. You think the board would be thrilled to learn about this? About how you use company trips to hook up with your mistresses? Richard's smirk faltered again, but he said nothing. Bennett turned to Grace. And you, he said, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. You don't get to play the victim here. You chose this. You chose him over me, over Emma, over the life we built together. I hope he was worth it. Grace's tears streamed down her face as she whispered, Bennett, I still love you. I do. Bennett shook his head, his face hard. No, Grace. You love yourself. And now you get to deal with the consequences. Bennett and Claire met again later that week, this time at Claire's home. The anger that had fueled their initial confrontation had cooled slightly, replaced by a calculated resolve. So, Claire began, pouring 2 cups of coffee and setting one in front of Bennett. What's the plan? Bennett leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. Grace's birthday is coming up. She and her mother have been planning this ridiculous party for weeks. Claire raised an eyebrow. And we use it, Bennett said simply. It's the perfect stage to expose them for who they really are. Claire took a sip of her coffee, nodding slowly. You want to humiliate them? Bennett met her gaze. I want them to feel the weight of what they've done. They've destroyed everything. They don't get to walk away from this unscathed. Claire set her mug down, a small smile playing on her lips. I like the way you think. They spent hours hashing out the details. Claire would ensure Richard attended the party, and Bennett would handle the rest. The goal was simple, to strip away the lies and force Grace and Richard to face the consequences of their actions. As the plan began to take shape, Bennett felt a sense of clarity for the first time since discovering the affair. He wasn't just going to be a victim. He was going to take control of the narrative. By the time they finished, Claire stood and extended her hand. Here's to justice, she said, her voice firm. Bennett shook her hand, a grim smile on his face. Here's to justice. As he drove home that night, Bennett felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. The confrontation had been brutal, but it had given him purpose. He wasn't just going to survive this. He was going to come out on top. The house was alive with the buzz of conversation and laughter as guests swirled around the grand living room. The chandelier overhead cast a warm glow over the space, glinting off polished wine glasses and sparkling jewelry. Grace, in a bold red gown, moved effortlessly through the crowd, her laughter ringing out as she greeted guests. She was the picture of charm and confidence, savoring every moment of her perfectly planned evening. Marjorie, her mother, held court near the buffet table, offering sharp commentary on anyone and everyone. "I told Grace to get these hors d'oeuvres catered," she remarked loudly to a small group of guests. "But she insists on doing everything herself. I suppose that's why she's so exhausted all the time. Poor thing. Some men just don't appreciate the effort." Bennett entered the house quietly, unnoticed at first. He stood near the doorway, scanning the room. He had dressed deliberately, sharp, confident, commanding, but he felt none of the ease or celebration in the air. His stomach churned, though he kept his face neutral. Marjorie spotted him first. Her lips curled into a sneer. "Oh, here he is," she said loudly, waving her glass of wine in his direction. Heads turned to look at Bennett, some politely, others curiously. Marjorie wasn't one for subtlety. "Decided to stop sulking and come celebrate. Have you? Try not to embarrass yourself, Bennett." Bennett approached slowly, his face unreadable. He stopped a few feet from Marjorie and gave her a cool smile. "I wouldn't dream of it," he said calmly. Grace noticed him next. She made her way over, her smile tight, but her eyes cold. "Bennett," she said, tilting her head. "You're here. Didn't think you'd make it." Bennett let the corner of his mouth twitch into something that might have been a smile. "Of course, I wouldn't miss your big night." Grace crossed her arms. "If you're here to cause drama, don't bother. I have people who care about me. Unlike you." Her tone was venomous, but her voice was low enough to avoid drawing the attention of nearby guests. Marjorie chimed in, clearly enjoying the tension. "He doesn't have the guts, Grace. Men like him sulk in corners and let life happen to them. You're better off, trust me." Bennett's grip tightened on the envelope he was holding, but his voice remained steady. "I'm just here to celebrate, Marjorie. I promise you'll find this evening unforgettable." Grace smirked, clearly dismissing him. "Whatever you're planning, don't embarrass yourself." She turned back to the crowd, ready to resume her performance as the star of the evening. As the night wore on, the party reached its peak. The dining room table was covered with expensive dishes, and the wine flowed freely. Marjorie had pulled Grace into a group of guests, loudly discussing Grace's hard work in organizing the party, while Bennett waited for the perfect moment. Finally, the time came. Bennett cleared his throat loudly, silencing the hum of conversation. All eyes turned toward him. He stood in the center of the room, holding the envelope in one hand, a wine glass in the other. "To my beautiful wife, Grace," he began, his voice calm and measured. Grace froze, her smile faltering slightly. "Happy birthday. This night is all about you, and I wanted to make sure it's one you'll never forget." Grace's face tightened, and Marjorie narrowed her eyes suspiciously. Bennett walked toward Grace and held out the envelope. "Here, a gift. Open it." Grace hesitated, her eyes darting between Bennett and the envelope. The room was dead silent now, the weight of anticipation pressing down on everyone. Slowly, she took the envelope and tore it open. The color drained from her face as she pulled out the divorce papers. Her hand trembled as she flipped through the pages, her eyes wide. "What the hell is this?" she hissed, her voice sharp but low. Bennett set his wine glass down on the nearest table and looked her square in the eye. "Divorce papers," he said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and whispers erupted as guests began exchanging shocked glances. Grace's voice rose, panic creeping into her tone. "Bennett, what are you doing? Why would you do this here?" Bennett took a step closer, his voice unwavering. "Because it's exactly where it needs to happen. Everyone here deserves to know the truth. You've been lying to me, to Emma, and to everyone in this room for months. Sleeping with your boss, sneaking around behind my back." Grace's composure cracked, her expression turning from shock to anger. "This isn't the place for this," she snapped. "Oh, I disagree," Bennett said, his voice growing sharper. "You've spent weeks planning this party, putting on a show, pretending to be the perfect wife and mother. I think it's the perfect stage to show everyone who you really are." Marjorie stormed forward, her face red with fury. "How dare you humiliate her like this? You've always been an insecure little man, Bennett, but this is pathetic." Bennett turned to her, his expression icy. Oh, I'm just getting started. Right on cue, the front door opened, and Claire stepped inside, holding a folder of her own. She walked straight to Richard, who had been standing near the bar, frozen like a deer in headlights. "Hello, darling," Claire said sweetly, her voice dripping with sarcasm. She handed Richard the folder. "Happy birthday to Grace, and happy divorce to you." Richard's face turned ashen as he opened the folder and scanned the documents. Claire smirked and leaned closer to him. "You didn't think I'd find out? I've known for weeks. And now, thanks to your little escapade, I'll be taking half of everything. Enjoy explaining that to the board." The room erupted into chaos. Guests whispered furiously, some moving to leave, others staying to watch the drama unfold. Grace grabbed Bennett's arm, her face desperate. "Bennett, please," she begged, tears spilling down her cheeks. "We can fix this. Don't do this here. Don't do this to Emma." Bennett yanked his arm free. "You did this to Emma. You threw away our family for him," he said, pointing to Richard. "You don't get to play the victim now." Richard tried to step in. "Bennett, let's be reasonable." "Reasonables?" Bennett interrupted, his voice rising. "You want reasonable? Here's reasonable. I've already secured full custody of Emma, moved my assets, and filed the paperwork. There's nothing left for you to take." Grace collapsed into a chair, sobbing, while Marjorie rounded on Bennett again. "You bastard," she screamed. "You'll regret this. You'll pay for this humiliation." Bennett looked at her calmly. "Funny. That's exactly what Grace and Richard are going to do." Claire stepped forward, addressing the crowd. "To anyone still wondering, these two," she pointed at Grace and Richard, "have been carrying on an affair for 6 months. They lied to their families, their friends, and their co-workers. And now, they're reaping the consequences." The silence that followed was deafening. Guests began to slip out quietly, some shaking their heads, others looking awkwardly at the ground. Bennett turned to Grace one last time. "Happy birthday, Grace. I hope it was everything you wanted." With that, he walked out of the house, leaving behind the wreckage of her carefully curated life. Claire followed, her heels clicking against the floor as Richard and Grace sat in stunned silence, their world crumbling around them. The room was a storm of whispered conversations, scattered gasps, and the shifting of feet as guests tried to decide whether to stay or leave. Grace stood frozen, staring at the divorce papers crumpled in her trembling hands. The silence in her head was deafening, drowning out the hum of murmurs around her until, finally, she collapsed to her knees. "Bennett, please," Grace sobbed, clutching the hem of his jacket. Tears streaked her mascara, leaving black trails down her cheeks. "Don't do this. I'm sorry. I made a mistake. Just one stupid mistake." Bennett stepped back, shaking her hand off his jacket like it was dirt. "One mistake," he said, his voice steady but cold. "You call 6 months of sneaking around a mistake? Do you think I'm stupid, Grace? I didn't mean to hurt you." Grace cried, her voice cracking. "Didn't mean to hurt me?" Bennett repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. He looked down at her, his eyes narrowing. "When you met him at hotels, when you lied to my face, did you stop and think, maybe this will hurt my husband? Maybe this will hurt my daughter?" Marjorie, clearly unaccustomed to the loss of control in any situation, stormed forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. "How dare you humiliate her like this, Bennett?" She spat, her face red with fury. "This is a private matter. You're a disgusting, petty little man, doing this in front of everyone. You'll pay for this. You think you can walk away from my daughter and destroy her life? You're nothing but a miserable excuse for a man." Bennett turned to her slowly, his calm demeanor unnerving. "Humiliate her?" he said with an icy smile. "No, Marjorie. She humiliated herself. She didn't think about her life, or yours, when she was spreading her legs for her boss." The gasps around the room grew louder as Marjorie's face twisted into pure rage. "You bastard," she screamed. Bennett ignored her and turned back to Grace. "You brought this on yourself. I spent years being the husband who supported you, respected you, trusted you, and this is what I got in return? No, Grace. You don't get to cry and beg now." Grace crawled forward on her knees, clutching his hand. "Bennett, please. Don't do this to Emma. She needs us. She needs you. Bennett pulled his hand free, his face hardening. You don't get to use Emma as a shield. You should have thought about her before you did this. But don't worry, Emma will be fine. She's better off without a mother who puts herself first at every turn. Behind Grace, Richard finally spoke, his voice strained, but trying to sound authoritative. Bennett, listen. Let's not make this worse than it needs to be. We're adults. We can work this out. Bennett turned his gaze to Richard, his jaw tightening. Work this out, he repeated, his voice rising. Do you think this is a business meeting? You slept with my wife. You destroyed your own marriage. The only thing you're going to work out now is how to pay for the fallout. Richard took a step back, his usual confidence faltering. Claire, standing to the side, smirked coldly. Don't bother, Richard, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. The only thing you've worked out is how to lose half your assets and custody of your kids. Congratulations. Grace turned to Claire, her desperation mounting. Please, she begged. Claire, you don't have to do this. You know what it's like. Marriage is hard. People make mistakes. Claire's laugh was sharp and humorless. Oh, Grace, don't insult my intelligence. A mistake is spilling a drink or forgetting an anniversary, not screwing your boss for half a year while pretending to be a devoted wife and mother. You made your choices, and now you'll deal with the consequences. Grace's sobs grew louder, but Claire's cold indifference silenced her. Bennett leaned in closer to Richard, his tone deadly calm. You think you're untouchable because of your position? Guess what? I've already sent copies of the photos and emails to your board. Let's see how they feel about your extracurricular activities. Richard's face turned white. You didn't? Bennett smiled darkly. Oh, I did. And you might want to check with HR, because by this time tomorrow, your wife's lawyer will have them too. You're going to lose your job, your marriage, and your reputation. As the reality of the situation sank in, the party began to unravel. Guests shuffled toward the door in awkward silence, some offering hushed apologies to Grace and Marjorie as they left. Marjorie chased after a few of them, trying to salvage her daughter's reputation. Don't listen to him, she shouted. Bennett's just bitter and vindictive. Grace is a wonderful mother, a wonderful wife, but her protests fell on deaf ears. The damage was done. Bennett stood near the doorway, watching the fallout with a strange sense of calm. Grace remained on the floor, crumpled like a discarded piece of paper, her sobs quieter now. Richard leaned against a wall, his head in his hands as Claire walked out without a backward glance. Grace looked up at Bennett one last time, her face streaked with tears. Bennett, she whispered. Please. I love you. Bennett stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he shook his head slowly. No, Grace. You love yourself. You love control. You don't know what love is, not the kind of love that sacrifices, forgives, or protects. Her lips trembled, but she didn't respond. Bennett grabbed his coat and keys from the entryway table, glancing around the wreckage of the party one last time. I'll send someone to pick up Emma's things, he said flatly. And don't bother fighting me in court. I already have everything I need to make sure Emma stays with me. He walked out, leaving Grace kneeling in the middle of the room. Marjorie rushed over to her, but even she couldn't muster the venom to shout at him anymore. Outside, the air was crisp and cool, and Bennett took a deep breath. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt like he could breathe. The weight of betrayal and deception had been lifted. As he walked to his car, Claire caught up with him. Well, she said, lighting a cigarette. That was cathartic. Bennett gave her a sidelong glance. You okay? Claire exhaled a cloud of smoke and smiled faintly. Oh, I'll be fine. Richard's been a lying bastard for years. I've been waiting for the right moment to put him in his place. You just gave me the perfect opportunity. Bennett nodded. Good luck. Divorce isn't easy, but it's worth it. Claire chuckled. You too, Bennett. Take care of Emma. With that, she walked off toward her car, leaving Bennett alone with his thoughts. As he drove away, Bennett felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. The life he had built was gone, shattered by betrayal. But in its place, there was something new, freedom, clarity, and the chance to rebuild. And he would, for himself, for Emma, and for the life he deserved. The first morning in the new apartment was eerily quiet. Bennett stood in the kitchen, sipping his coffee as sunlight poured through the blinds. The place wasn't much, a modest two-bedroom unit with mismatched furniture, but it was theirs. His and Emma's. "Dad, where's the cereal?" Emma called from the living room, sitting cross-legged in front of her favorite cartoons. Bennett chuckled and opened a cabinet, pulling out a box. "Coming right up, kiddo. You want milk too? Or are we eating it dry like usual?" "Milk," she said, grinning. "We're fancy now, remember?" Bennett set the bowl down in front of her and ruffled her hair. "Fancy, huh? Well, don't get used to it. Fancy cereal today, grilled cheese tomorrow." Emma laughed, and for a moment, Bennett felt a flicker of hope. Maybe things really could be better. The old life, the lies, the tension, the constant sense of inadequacy was behind him. His focus now was Emma, and everything else would come second. The first few weeks were an adjustment. Bennett juggled work and parenting, often staying up late to finish reports after putting Emma to bed. He joined a local gym, rediscovering the sense of control and clarity that came with exercise. On weekends, they explored the city together, museums, parks, even a trip to the zoo. "Do you think the penguins get bored?" Emma asked one day, holding his hand as they watched the animals waddle around their enclosure. Bennett smiled. "Maybe, but I bet they'd still rather be here than somewhere cold and lonely." Emma nodded, satisfied with his answer. Bennett didn't say it out loud, but he realized he wasn't just talking about penguins. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Bennett took Emma to the park. She had begged to bring her new bike, a bright pink one with a basket and training wheels, and Bennett agreed. "Dad, watch me," Emma called, wobbling slightly as she pedaled down the path. "I'm watching," Bennett shouted back, jogging to keep up. As Emma navigated a sharp turn, narrowly avoiding another child, Bennett slowed down, catching his breath. That's when he noticed her, Camila. She was sitting on a nearby bench, a book in her lap, but her eyes trained on her son, who was kicking a soccer ball in the grass. Their eyes met briefly, and she smiled, a warm, genuine smile that caught Bennett off guard. He nodded in acknowledgement and kept walking, but something about her lingered in his mind. Later, as Emma played on the swings, Camila approached him. "Your daughter's got some serious bike skills," she said with a grin. Bennett laughed. "Yeah, she's fearless. I just hope she doesn't try to tackle stairs next." Camila chuckled, extending her hand. "I'm Camila, by the way. That's my son, Liam." She gestured toward the boy still absorbed in his soccer game. "Bennett," he replied, shaking her hand. "And that's Emma, the future Tour de France champion." They talked casually for a while, sharing stories about their kids and parenting challenges. Bennett learned that Camila was also divorced, though she didn't go into detail. He didn't press, after all. He had his own scars, and he knew how painful it could be to revisit them. Before they left, Camila handed him a slip of paper. "There's a single-parents group that meets at the library every Thursday. It's low-key, just people sharing tips and sometimes venting about how insane life can be. You should come." Bennett hesitated, but her smile was disarming. "I'll think about it," he said, tucking the paper into his pocket. The library group turned out to be surprisingly refreshing. Bennett was initially reluctant to share much about his situation, but as the weeks went by, he found himself opening up about Grace, the betrayal, and his fears for Emma. Camila was a regular at the group, and their casual conversations turned into something more. They started meeting outside the group, coffee at a nearby cafe, playdates for Emma and Liam at the park. Slowly, Bennett felt the walls he'd built around himself begin to crumble. One evening, after the kids had fallen asleep during a movie night at Camila's house, she brought out 2 glasses of wine and joined Bennett on the couch. "To survival," she said, raising her glass. "To survival," Bennett echoed, clinking his glass against hers. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Camila spoke again. "I know it's hard to trust again after what you've been through," she said softly. "I've been there, but you're doing an amazing job, Bennett. Emma's lucky to have you." Bennett studied her face, the sincerity in her eyes. "It's not just about trust," he admitted. "It's about rebuilding, figuring out who I am without all the baggage." Camila smiled gently. "Maybe you're not rebuilding. Maybe you're just uncovering the parts of yourself that were always there." As their relationship deepened, Bennett learned more about Camila's past. One evening, as they were cleaning up after dinner, she mentioned her previous job. "I used to work in marketing," she said, scrubbing a plate. "Big firm, lots of egos. It was exhausting." "Why'd you leave?" Bennett asked, drying the plate she handed him. Camila hesitated, her expression darkening. "One of the execs, Richard something, was a nightmare. Manipulative, arrogant, thought he could do whatever he wanted just because of his title. I couldn't take it anymore, so I quit." Bennett froze, the plate slipping from his hands and landing on the counter with a clatter. "Richard," he said slowly. "Richard Kent?" Camila's eyes widened. "Yeah, you know him." Bennett let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, I know him. He's the guy my ex-wife had an affair with." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Camila's face hardened. "That doesn't surprise me. He was always a creep, flirting with everyone, making people uncomfortable." "I'm sorry, Bennett. You didn't deserve that." Bennett shook his head, a mixture of anger and disbelief swirling inside him. "The worst part is, he's still trying to play the victim, as if he didn't blow up 2 families. Camila bit her lip, as if debating something. "You know, I kept a folder of emails and reports from my time there. Stuff I thought might come in handy if I ever needed to report him. I didn't. But if it could help you in any way," Bennett looked at her, a surge of gratitude welling up. "You do that?" "Of course," Camila said firmly. "People like him don't deserve to get away with it." With Camila's evidence, Bennett's custody battle took a decisive turn. The emails and reports painted Richard as the manipulative and unethical man he truly was, and the court sided with Bennett. Grace's attempts to argue for joint custody fell flat, and Bennett was granted full custody of Emma. After the hearing, Camila was waiting outside the courthouse. Bennett approached her, his face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "It's done," he said, his voice trembling. Camila smiled and hugged him tightly. "You did it. Emma's going to be okay." Bennett pulled back slightly, looking into her eyes. "We're going to be okay." And for the first time in a long time, he truly believed it. Grace sat alone in a cramped, dimly lit apartment. The sound of a dripping faucet echoed through the silence as she stared blankly at the eviction notice on the table. The apartment was a far cry from the spacious home she once shared with Bennett and Emma. The bright red gown she had worn on her birthday, now a painful reminder of her humiliation, hung lifeless in the corner of her closet. Her phone buzzed on the counter, but she ignored it. She already knew what it was, another rejection email. Ever since the affair became public, finding work had been impossible. News of her relationship with Richard had spread like wildfire, and her name had become synonymous with scandal. Her once steady life was now in ruins. The custody battle had been the final blow. Standing in court, hearing the judge rule in Bennett's favor, was like a dagger to her chest. "How could you let this happen?" she had hissed at her lawyer after the hearing. "The evidence was damning, Grace," he replied curtly. "You handed Bennett everything he needed to win. You need to take responsibility for your choices." Her choices. The words rang in her ears as she sat at the table, sipping cheap wine from a chipped glass. She hadn't seen Emma in weeks. The court allowed her supervised visitation, but she couldn't bear to face Bennett's icy gaze or Emma's confused, hurt eyes. Desperate, she picked up her phone and dialed Bennett's number. "What do you want, Grace?" His voice was cold, detached. "Bennett, please," she began, her voice cracking. "I want to see Emma. Just for a little while." "You've seen her." "In court." "That's the arrangement," he replied. "Bennett, please don't do this," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "I'm her mother. She needs me." "She needed you when you were sneaking around with Richard," Bennett snapped. "You chose him over your family, Grace. This is the result." Before she could respond, he hung up. Grace clutched the phone to her chest, sobbing. The loneliness was unbearable, but worse than that was the knowledge that she had done this to herself. Richard leaned back in the tattered armchair of his dingy motel room, staring at the unpaid bills scattered across the coffee table. The smell of stale cigarettes and cheap air freshener filled the air. His once impeccable suits now hung loosely on his thinning frame. He poured a shot of whiskey into a glass and downed it in one gulp, grimacing as the cheap liquor burned his throat. He had lost everything: his wife, his children, and his career. Claire had taken the kids and filed for divorce the same day Bennett revealed the affair at Grace's birthday party. Richard had tried to fight her, but Claire was prepared. Armed with evidence from Camila and a team of ruthless lawyers, she had dismantled his reputation piece by piece. "You think you could cheat on me and get away with it?" Claire had spat during their last confrontation. "You've humiliated me, Richard, and now you're going to pay for it." And pay he did. The court awarded Claire full custody of their children, along with a significant portion of their assets. The scandal had spread quickly, and his colleagues at the firm turned their backs on him. Within weeks, he was asked to resign, leaving him without income or prospects. Now, he spent his days drinking and wallowing in self-pity. Every attempt to rebuild his career was met with rejection. One afternoon, his phone buzzed with a message from Grace. "Grace, we need to talk. Everything's falling apart." He stared at the screen for a moment before tossing the phone aside. He didn't want to deal with her. Grace had been nothing but trouble since the affair was exposed. She had once been exciting, a thrill he couldn't resist, but now she was just another reminder of his failures. "You're on your own, Grace," he muttered, pouring himself another drink. Marjorie sat stiffly in the overstuffed chair of her immaculate living room, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. The silence in the house was oppressive. Once, it had been filled with the laughter of her granddaughter and the chatter of family gatherings. Now it felt like a tomb. She hadn't heard from Grace in days. After the party, their relationship had soured. Grace had lashed out, blaming Marjorie for encouraging her affair with Richard and dismissing Bennett's worth as a husband. "You were the one who told me I deserved better than Bennett," Grace had screamed during their last argument. "You told me to go after Richard. I didn't tell you to destroy your family." Marjorie had shot back. "I raised you better than this." But had she? Marjorie's sharp tongue and constant meddling had always created tension between Bennett and Grace. She had dismissed Bennett as boring and pushed Grace to seek excitement elsewhere, even if it meant jeopardizing her marriage. Now, the consequences of her actions were impossible to ignore. Grace was miserable, Emma was gone, and Marjorie was left to reflect on the damage she had caused. She reached for her phone and dialed Grace's number. "Mom?" Grace's voice was hoarse, as though she'd been crying. "Grace," Marjorie said softly. I wanted to check on you." "I'm fine," Grace replied bitterly. "Not that it matters to anyone." "It matters to me," Marjorie said. "I know I haven't always said the right things, but I want to help." Grace laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Help? You're the one who told me Bennett wasn't good enough. Look where that got me." Marjorie flinched, guilt washing over her. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I was wrong. Bennett was a good man, and I didn't see it. I just wanted you to have the best, but I ended up pushing you toward disaster." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Grace spoke. "It's too late, Mom. I've lost everything. Ben and Emma, they're gone." Marjorie's chest tightened. For the first time, she realized how deeply her arrogance and meddling had hurt not only Grace, but everyone around her. "I'll be here if you need me," she said, her voice trembling. Grace didn't respond, and the line went dead. Marjorie set the phone down, her hands shaking. For the first time in years, she felt truly powerless. That night, all three of them, Grace, Richard, and Marjorie, were alone, each consumed by their own regrets. Grace stood in front of her bathroom mirror, staring at her reflection. The confident, beautiful woman she once was seemed like a distant memory. Now, all she saw was someone broken, someone who had let her selfish desires destroy everything that mattered. Richard sat on the edge of his motel bed, clutching a photograph of his children. He didn't deserve their forgiveness, but he longed for it all the same. The realization that his actions had cost him not only his marriage, but his place in their lives was a pain he couldn't numb, no matter how much he drank. Marjorie sat in her empty living room, staring at an old family photo. In it, Bennett stood beside Grace, holding a young Emma in his arms. They looked so happy then. She had thought she was protecting Grace, guiding her toward a better life, but she had only pushed her daughter further into chaos. Each of them, in their own way, was left to confront the wreckage they had created. And for the first time, they understood the weight of their choices. For Grace, Richard, and Marjorie, The downfall was not just about losing their relationships or their reputations. It was about losing themselves. And there was no one to blame but each other. Bennett stood at the head of the dining table, his home alive with laughter and warmth. Camila was in the kitchen preparing dessert, her melodic humming filling the air, while Emma excitedly recounted her day at school. The contrast between this moment and the life Bennett had left behind was stark. Here, there was peace, trust, and love, a stark difference from the chaos Grace and her betrayal had wrought. "Daddy, guess what?" Emma chirped, climbing into his lap with a mischievous grin. "What's that, sweetheart?" Bennett asked, wrapping an arm around her. "I got an A+ on my science project," she exclaimed. Bennett beamed. "That's my girl. I'm so proud of you." Emma giggled, leaning into his chest. In moments like these, Bennett knew he had made the right choice. Emma was flourishing, and he had regained control of his life. Across the room, Camila appeared with a plate of cookies. "For the A+ achiever," she teased, setting the plate down in front of Emma. "Cookies and spaghetti for dinner? Best day ever," Emma declared. Camila and Bennett exchanged a look, smiling. They had worked hard to build this new life, and now it was finally paying off. Later that night, as Bennett tucked Emma into bed, she looked up at him with her big, curious eyes. "Daddy, why doesn't Mommy visit anymore?" Bennett paused, his heart twisting. He always tried to shield Emma from the ugliness of what had happened, but questions like these were inevitable. "Mommy loves you, Emma," he said carefully. "But sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and those mistakes can make it hard for them to be around." "Did she make a big mistake?" Emma asked, frowning. Bennett nodded. "She did. But what's important is that you're happy and safe, and I'll always be here for you." Satisfied, Emma smiled sleepily. "I love you, Daddy. I love you too, sweetheart." He kissed her forehead, turned off the light, and closed the door softly behind him. As he walked down the hall, Camila was waiting for him. "Was it another tough question?" she asked, wrapping her arms around him. Bennett sighed. "Yeah, but I'm getting better at answering them." He kissed her on the forehead. "Thanks for being here, Camila. I couldn't do this without you." "You don't have to," she said with a warm smile. Meanwhile, across town, Grace sat in a courtroom, clutching a crumpled tissue in her hand. This was her fourth contempt hearing for failing to make child support payments. The judge's voice was cold and detached as he addressed her. "Miss Carter, you've missed 3 consecutive payments. Do you have any explanation?" Grace's voice cracked. "Your Honor, I lost my job. I'm trying to find work, but that's not good enough," the judge interrupted. "The court order is clear. If you fail to make another payment, we'll have no choice but to pursue further legal action." Grace's shoulders slumped as the judge banged his gavel. The reality of her situation hit her hard as she shuffled out of the courtroom. The reporters who had once hounded her during the height of the scandal were gone. Now, she was just another name on the docket, a cautionary tale of greed and poor choices. Later that evening, she sat in her dimly lit apartment, scrolling through social media. Her feed was filled with photos of Bennett and Emma, smiling and happy. The life she once had now belonged to someone else, and she had no one to blame but herself. Richard wasn't faring much better. After losing his job and his marriage, he had tried to start over, but his reputation followed him wherever he went. He had burned every bridge, and even the most menial jobs were hard to come by. Sitting at a dive bar, Richard nursed a cheap beer as he scrolled through his emails. Rejection after rejection greeted him. "What happened to you, man?" the bartender asked, refilling his glass. Richard let out a bitter laugh. "What didn't happen?" The bartender shrugged. "Sounds like karma." Richard scowled but said nothing. Deep down, he knew the bartender was right. A few weeks later, Bennett sat at his desk, reviewing final paperwork for the sale of a property he had been working on. His career in real estate had taken off in the wake of his personal life stabilizing. Success had come not from revenge, but from his focus and determination to build something meaningful. As he filed the last document, his assistant knocked on the door. "Bennett, there's someone here to see you," she said hesitantly. She didn't have an appointment, but before Bennett could respond, Grace stepped into the office. She looked thinner, her once pristine appearance replaced by a disheveled and defeated demeanor. "Bennett," she began, her voice trembling. Can we talk? Bennett leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. I'm listening. Grace hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. I made a mistake. I let everything slip away. I lost you, Emma, everything that mattered. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Bennett studied her for a moment. Grace, I've moved on. I've rebuilt my life, and Emma's happy. That's all that matters to me. I know, she whispered, her tears spilling over. But I miss her so much, Bennett. Please, let me see her more. Bennett's voice was firm. You'll see her according to the court's decision. If you want more time, prove you've changed. That's the only way. Grace nodded, defeated. Thank you, she said quietly before leaving the office. As the door closed, Bennett exhaled deeply. Camila entered the room, having overheard the exchange. You okay? She asked, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. I am, Bennett replied with a small smile. That part of my life is over. She's not my problem anymore. That weekend, Bennett, Camila, and Emma went hiking at a nearby park. Emma ran ahead, chasing butterflies while Bennett and Camila walked hand in hand. You've come a long way, Camila said. I couldn't have done it without you, Bennett replied. Camila stopped and looked at him, her eyes full of love. You've done more than you think, Bennett. You're not just rebuilding your life. You're showing Emma what strength and love look like. Bennett smiled, pulling her into a gentle kiss. And you're showing me what happiness feels like again. As they reached the top of the hill, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in vibrant shades of orange and pink. Emma ran back to them, grabbing both their hands. Look, Daddy, it's so pretty. It is, sweetheart, Bennett said, his heart full. In that moment, Bennett knew he had won, not just against Grace, Richard, and Marjorie, but against the bitterness and pain that had threatened to consume him. He had reclaimed his life, and now he had everything he needed to be happy. Bennett's revenge wasn't just in the suffering of those who wronged him. It was in his triumph, his peace, and his ability to find love and trust again.